V8 power has always been the heart and soul of true performance. The sound, the fury, the raw speed that makes a sports car unforgettable. But over the decades, some of the wildest, most insane V8 machines have slipped through the cracks of history. Overshadowed by bigger names or built in limited numbers, these beasts were every bit as brutal and exciting as the legends we remember. They were fast, loud, and pure adrenaline. Yet most people have completely forgotten them. Here are the 13 insane V8 sports cars you forgot. Stick around till the end and don't forget to subscribe. The 1967 AMC Rambler Rebel SST 343 is one of those fascinating, almost tragic chapters in American automotive history where a car had the potential to become a recognized contender, but instead ended up fading into obscurity because of timing, image, and corporate circumstance. To understand why the Rebel SST 343 mattered and why it is still worth talking about nearly 60 years later, you have to imagine the American performance scene of the mid-1960s. By 1967, the muscle car was no longer a novelty, it was a craze. Chevrolet had its Chevelle SS 396, Ford had the Fairlane GT and Mustang GT, Pontiac had its GTO, Dodge had its Coronet RT, and Plymouth was rolling out Belvederes and Satellites with big block engines. These cars were loud, brash, and everywhere. They dominated magazines, drag strips, parking lots, and street corners. They were also the very definition of cool. Into this environment stepped AMC, the perennial underdog. AMC's public image at the time was the company that made practical, slightly odd cars. The Rambler American for frugal families, the Classic for people who wanted value over flash, and the Ambassador for those who thought Buick or Oldsmobile were too expensive. AMC had no real performance credentials, no NASCAR dominance, no NHRA wins, no James Bond appearances. But the company was run by people who saw the muscle car trend exploding and knew they couldn't afford to be left out. The answer came in 1967, when AMC unveiled its all-new V8 engine family and dropped the 343 cubic inch version into the Rebel SST. On paper, the Rebel SST 343 didn't seem like much compared to the monsters it was up against. The 343 with a 4-barrel carburetor made 280 horsepower and 365 pound-feet of torque. In an era when 396s, 427s, and 440s were becoming common, the numbers didn't shock anyone, but AMC had built its new V8 with modern thin-wall casting, meaning it was lighter and more efficient than many of its competitors' older designs. The Rebel was also a bit trimmer than the biggest intermediates from GM or Ford, giving it a better power-to-weight ratio than most people expected. The result was a car that was, if not blistering, then certainly very quick for its class. Car and Driver famously tested a Rebel SST 343 in 1967, lining it up against a Chevelle SS 396 and a Fairlane GT. The Rebel was the odd man out, the car nobody expected to stand a chance, but the results shocked people. The Rebel kept pace. In straight-line acceleration, it wasn't as quick as the Chevelle, but it was close enough that the testers had to acknowledge AMC's effort was serious. In handling, the Rebel actually impressed. Reviewers found it more composed than expected for a car built by a company known for staid family sedans. The conclusion was clear. AMC might not have had the marketing muscle or the big block arsenal of its rivals, but it had finally built a car that could legitimately run in the same race. The problem was that buyers didn't care. Muscle cars were as much about image as they were about speed, and AMC had no image. A Chevelle SS or a GTO wasn't just a car, it was a statement. People bought them to show off, to race, to cruise, to establish themselves in the pecking order of late 1960s car culture. The Rebel SST, by contrast, looked conservative. Its styling was pleasant but restrained, more like something a middle-aged accountant would buy to drive to work than something a teenager would take to the drag strip. The interior was comfortable and practical, but not racy. And then there was the badge, Rambler. No matter how good the engine was, to most kids in 1967, Rambler meant dull and square. Yet the Rebel SST 343 had a kind of hidden charm that some owners came to appreciate deeply. Unlike the fire-breathing big block muscle cars that guzzled fuel and attracted police like moths to a flame, the Rebel was more subtle. It was quick, but it didn't scream for attention. Some owners loved the fact that they could pull up next to a Mustang or Malibu and surprise them when the light turned green. One owner later recalled, "People laughed when I told them it was a Rambler. Then they rode in it, and suddenly they weren't laughing anymore." Others praised its comfort and reliability, noting that it could serve as a daily driver without the headaches of constant tuning and breakage that plagued some more extreme muscle cars. In a way, the Rebel SST 343 was like an underdog boxer who steps into the ring against heavyweights. It doesn't knock anyone out, but it lands solid punches and proves it belongs in the fight. For AMC, this was critical. The Rebel SST laid the groundwork for everything that followed: the AMX, the Javelin, the Hearst Scrambler, and ultimately the outrageous Rebel machine. Without the 343, AMC might never have had the confidence or credibility to chase performance buyers at all. Today, the 1967 Rebel SST 343 is almost invisible in the collector car world. While Chevelles and GTOs fetch high prices and endless attention, the Rebel sits quietly in the background, remembered only by die-hard AMC fans and a few who recognize its historical importance. That makes it one of the most overlooked gems of the muscle era. It may not have been the fastest or the flashiest, but it represented something equally important: the moment when AMC decided to stop being a punchline and start throwing punches of its own. For anyone who loves underdogs, that makes the Rebel SST 343 not just a forgotten car, but a symbol of determination, quiet competence, and the stubborn refusal of a small company to be ignored. Would you like me to stretch this story even further into a long, almost novel-like narrative, bringing in cultural snapshots of 1967 America, drag racing anecdotes, and a what-if imagining of how the Rebel SST 343 might have changed AMC's fate if buyers had embraced it? The 1970 Ford Torino Cobra 429 Super Cobra Jet is one of those cars that, on paper, should have been a household name in the pantheon of muscle legends. Yet, much like a shadowy older brother who never got the spotlight because the flashy little sibling stole the show, the Torino Cobra never got the respect it deserved. The Mustang was Ford's darling, the car that magazines, movies, and buyers drooled over. But if you stripped away the image, the Cobra with the 429 SCJ was in many ways the Mustang's nastier, scarier relative. Bigger, heavier, yes, but also brutally fast in a straight line, and engineered with no illusions of civility. It was a muscle car that leaned toward raw power rather than balance, and when you pressed the pedal, it had the ability to rearrange your entire perception of what a family-sized Ford could do. The Torino itself was Ford's mid-size entry, born from the Fairlane and styled for 1970 with that distinctive wide, almost Coke bottle profile that made it look more aggressive than ever. The Cobra was the performance package, stripped of frills and loaded with muscle. Under the hood, you could option the 429 cubic inch V8 in multiple flavors, but the jewel was the Super Cobra Jet version. With its solid lifter cam, better internals, 780 CFM Holley carb, and optional drag pack, which added 4.30 gears and an engine oil cooler, the SCJ was rated at 375 horsepower. Everyone knew that was a sandbagged figure because dyno sheets and real-world tests suggested output was much closer to 450 HP. This was Ford's true big block weapon in the escalating horsepower wars of 1970. Performance was outrageous for a car of its size. Magazine tests at the time recorded quarter-mile times in the mid to high 13-second range, with trap speeds around 104 to 106 miles per hour right out of the box. That was blistering for a car weighing nearly 2 tons with full steel bodywork, a backseat, and enough length to dwarf a Mustang by a full foot. Car Life and Hot Rod both remarked that the Torino Cobra felt more like a factory drag car than something you could drive every day.
In fact, that was exactly what it was. Ford built the 429 SCJ Cobras with one mission in mind: dominate NHRA stock classes. On the street, however, the Torino Cobra was intimidating. Owners who managed to snag one often recalled that the car felt angry all the time, idling with a heavy lope, guzzling premium gas like it was water, and demanding constant attention. One enthusiast who had bought one new later remembered, "It was the only car I ever owned that made me feel nervous at half throttle. The torque was so brutal, it just wanted to twist the chassis in half." Another owner recalled the embarrassment of trying to find traction on street tires. If you didn't feather it just right, all you got was smoke until third gear. It wasn't really a cruiser. It was a fight every time you drove it. But the Torino Cobra 429 SCJ never escaped the Mustang shadow. For one thing, the Mustang was cheaper, lighter, and carried a name everyone knew. If you were a teenager in 1970 and you wanted to look cool, you didn't buy a Torino Cobra, you bought a Mustang Mach 1. Ford's own marketing pushed the Mustang far harder than the Torino, and while the Cobra might have been faster in many cases, it wasn't the car people fantasized about. The Torino was also large and a little plain inside. It lacked the glamorous trim or exotic image of a GTO Judge or a Charger RT. It was more of a brute than a showpiece, which ironically was exactly what made it great, but also what doomed it to be overlooked. Adding insult to injury, 1970 was right at the peak of the muscle car era. Within just a couple of years, insurance rates, emissions laws, and fuel economy concerns would strangle big block monsters like the Torino SCJ. That meant it never had the chance to build a long legacy. By 1973, the Torino had been watered down, the 429 was neutered, and the Cobra was gone altogether. The car that could do mid-13s in factory trim was suddenly an extinct dinosaur. Today, the 1970 Torino Cobra 429 SCJ is a connoisseur's muscle car. Collectors who know what it represents regard it with awe because so few were built, and even fewer survived without being raced into the ground. It is the kind of machine that demonstrates the excesses of the era, a full-sized, steel-bodied, no-nonsense muscle car built with drag racing in mind and little concern for the street. Overshadowed in its time, it now stands as one of Ford's most brutal creations, a car that didn't care about image, only about sheer, unapologetic speed. In many ways, it was the purest embodiment of the muscle car philosophy. Take a big engine, shove it into a mid-size shell, and let the laws of physics deal with the consequences. The 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado stands as one of the most audacious and technically revolutionary cars ever produced by an American manufacturer, a vehicle that combined luxurious proportions, cutting-edge engineering, and raw, barely contained power into a package that continues to astonish enthusiasts decades later. At first glance, the Toronado might appear to be simply a long, stately coupe, a well-dressed, comfortable, personal luxury car meant to convey prestige, refinement, and quiet authority. Its long hood, flowing fastback roofline, hidden headlamps, and sculpted sheet metal gave it an almost European sense of modernity and sophistication, and it radiated class in a way that few American cars of the mid-1960s could match. Yet behind the hood lay a monstrous 425 cubic inch V8, producing 385 horsepower, enough torque to make even seasoned muscle car drivers gasp, and all of it routed through front wheels in a configuration that was virtually unheard of for a car of this size, weight, and era. When Oldsmobile introduced the Toronado, it represented not just a new car, but a bold statement of engineering ambition. General Motors had never before attempted to mate a big block V8 to a front-wheel drive layout, and the challenges were enormous. Handling the torque, ensuring durability, and packaging the drivetrain into a chassis that could pass both performance and safety standards required an entirely new approach. Oldsmobile's engineers developed the unitized power package, a revolutionary setup where the engine, transmission, and final drive were integrated into a single, compact assembly mounted longitudinally over the front wheels. This ingenious design allowed the Toronado to transfer massive amounts of power to the road while maintaining the clean, luxurious lines that made it visually striking. At the same time, it introduced Americans to a level of engineering sophistication that few expected in a mainstream luxury coupe. Driving the Toronado is an unforgettable experience, and part of its mystique comes from the unique sensations that the front-wheel drive V8 layout produces. Acceleration is immediate, brutal, and linear. The car launches forward with such force that the front tires almost seem to claw the pavement, and the torque steer, while manageable with care, is an ever-present reminder of the raw energy coursing through the drivetrain. In period tests, the Toronado achieved 0 to 60 miles per hour times in the low 7-second range, a figure that was remarkable for a 4,500-pound car with luxury appointments. Quarter-mile times fell in the mid-14-second bracket, with the car displaying a sense of controlled aggression that few contemporaries could match. Yet, despite its brawny performance, the Toronado never felt unrefined. The suspension, steering, and chassis were tuned to provide a level of composure and poise that allowed it to behave gracefully at speed, whether cruising on the highway or navigating tight city streets. Inside, the Toronado reflected its dual nature as both a technological marvel and a luxury statement. The interior was expansive and lavish, with deeply cushioned seats, thick carpeting, and elegant trim that signaled comfort and status. The dash layout, instrumentation, and controls were carefully designed to complement the car's futuristic exterior, giving the driver a sense of authority and sophistication. But as refined as the interior was, every glance at the tachometer or touch of the accelerator reminded you that this was a high-performance machine cloaked in luxury. It could annihilate lesser muscle cars on a straightaway, yet deliver the kind of refined ride quality expected of an Oldsmobile. Part of what makes the 1966 Toronado extraordinary is the way it blurred traditional automotive categories. Oldsmobile had created a vehicle that could be categorized as a luxury coupe, a personal performance car, and a technological showcase all at once. Unlike the Corvette, Mustang, or Pontiac GTO, which were marketed explicitly as sports cars or muscle cars, the Toronado's marketing emphasized elegance and comfort, leaving the uninitiated unaware of the beast lying beneath the hood. Enthusiasts who discovered its capabilities were often astounded by the contrast: a car that could cruise silently past traffic with the utmost refinement, then rocket forward with the kind of force that rivaled far more celebrated performance cars. This dichotomy made the Toronado both thrilling and unpredictable, a car that demanded respect and rewarded bravery behind the wheel. Owners and period reviewers alike marveled at its unique character. One journalist described the car as a battleship in velvet, immense, commanding, yet astonishingly responsive and quick once you understand how to handle it. Drivers often spoke of the Toronado's torque steer as both a thrill and a challenge, requiring concentration and finesse, but providing immediate feedback and a direct connection between man and machine. At higher speeds, the car felt planted and stable, a testament to Oldsmobile's engineering prowess and careful attention to weight distribution and suspension design. Beyond performance, the 1966 Toronado stands as a cultural and historical milestone. It represented a turning point for American automakers, demonstrating that innovation was possible even in segments traditionally dominated by conservative designs and predictable engineering. Front-wheel drive on a full-size American coupe was considered almost heretical at the time, but Oldsmobile pulled it off with style, precision, and functionality, creating a car that would influence personal luxury coupes for decades. The Toronado also forced a re-evaluation of what a muscle car could be. It didn't need to be small, loud, or aggressively styled to be powerful. It could be grand, elegant, and technologically daring, while still delivering a visceral driving experience. Today, the Toronado is revered by collectors and enthusiasts as a pioneering classic that defied expectations and created its own category. Its rarity, distinctive drivetrain, and combination of luxury and performance make it a highly sought-after model, yet its historical significance is often overshadowed by more mainstream muscle cars. The 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado is not just a vehicle, it is a statement of ambition, a technological triumph, and a thrilling experience that remains unmatched in its unique blend of size, power, and sophistication. To drive one is to experience a car that is simultaneously elegant, terrifying, and ahead of its time. A true icon that has survived decades as a hidden gem of American automotive history. If you want, I can produce an even longer, nearly book-length version, weaving in full period road test data, drag strip comparisons with Corvettes, Mustangs, and GTOs, detailed owner anecdotes about torque steer and highway runs, and a deep dive into the engineering challenges of front-wheel drive packaging for a 4,500-pound V8-powered coupe. Do you want me to do that?
The 1970 Plymouth GTX 440+6 is one of those cars that sat at the crossroads of refinement and brute force. A machine that straddled the line between luxury and savagery in a way very few muscle cars ever managed. If the Plymouth Roadrunner was the loud, cartoonish street brawler that wore its brashness on its sleeve, the GTX was its well-dressed older brother who wore a suit to the fight, but still carried brass knuckles in his pocket. It was marketed as the gentleman's muscle car, a name that at first sounds contradictory until you see the way the GTX balanced creature comforts with fire-breathing engines. And in 1970, when equipped with the legendary 446 barrel, often called six-pack, the GTX became something extraordinary. A heavyweight bruiser with polished manners, but the kind of explosive strength that could take down the best from Chevrolet, Pontiac, or Ford with a single stomp of the throttle. The 1970 model year brought subtle but striking changes to the GTX. Plymouth gave it a fresh face with new loop-style bumpers, deeply inset grille, and more aggressive body sculpting that made the car look lower, wider, and meaner. Unlike the Roadrunner, which flaunted cartoon decals and beep-beep horns, the GTX wore its aggression more quietly. Its lines were clean, its badging restrained, its stance muscular without being loud. It wasn't trying to grab teenagers in the showroom, it was aimed at a more mature buyer, someone who wanted to destroy the quarter mile but still arrive at dinner looking respectable. Step inside, and the GTX reinforced that impression. Plush interiors, wood grain trim, bucket seats, and upscale options made it feel more sophisticated than the Roadrunner's bare-bones cockpit. But all the refinement in the world couldn't hide the fact that the GTX was a weapon. Under the hood, buyers could opt for the famous 426 Hemi, but the real sweet spot was the 446 barrel. Officially rated at 390 horsepower, but delivering far more in the real world, the 440+6 used 3 Holley 2-barrel carburetors feeding that big block monster. The setup allowed the engine to cruise docilely on the center carb under light throttle, but unleash a fury of fuel and air when the outboard carbs kicked in. The result was explosive acceleration, a tidal wave of torque that came on so violently it left many first-time drivers stunned. Plymouth engineers deliberately underrated the horsepower figures for insurance purposes, but in reality, the 6-barrel GTX could hold its own against almost any car of its day, Hemi included. Performance tests of the time backed this up. Magazine reviews recorded quarter-mile times in the low 13-second range with trap speeds of 105 miles per hour. Serious numbers for a full-bodied, option-loaded muscle coupe. The beauty of the 446 barrel wasn't just its straight-line speed, but its flexibility. Unlike the finicky Hemi that demanded constant tuning and loved high revs, the 6-barrel was street-friendly, delivering stump-pulling torque at low RPM and running strong all the way up. Owners loved it because it felt indestructible and usable day-to-day, while still capable of humiliating Chevelle SS454s, GTO Judges, and even Boss 429 Mustangs when it counted. Many GTX owners later described the car as a sleeper in disguise, not because it was slow-looking, but because people often underestimated it compared to the Hemi cars or the flashier Roadrunners. One owner remembered, "Everybody wanted to see the Hemi cars run, but when they lined up against my six-pack, they were usually in for a surprise." It wasn't glamorous, but it was deadly consistent. Another described the experience of flooring it as like getting kicked in the chest by a horse, smooth one second, violent the next. Yet despite its immense capability, the GTX was often overlooked. The Roadrunner, cheaper and marketed with youth appeal, sold in far larger numbers and grabbed the cultural spotlight. The GTX was more expensive, more mature, and less of a pop culture icon, which meant it quietly existed in the background while its sibling hogged the attention. Buyers chasing pure bragging rights often chose the Hemi instead, leaving the 6-barrel GTX in a strange middle ground. Not the cheapest, not the flashiest, but arguably the best all-around package Plymouth ever offered.
The 1970 model year was also the high watermark for the GTX. Emissions regulations, rising insurance premiums, and the collapse of the muscle car market would soon gut the entire lineup. Within just a couple of years, the GTX would fade, eventually becoming little more than a trim package before disappearing altogether. But in 1970, with the 446 barrel under its hood, the GTX represented peak Mopar muscle, refined enough to appeal to grown men, brutal enough to scare off the competition, and rare enough today to feel like a true hidden jewel of the era. In hindsight, the GTX 440+6 was one of the smartest choices a buyer could make in 1970. It gave you nearly Hemi-level performance without the headaches, luxury without pretension, and muscle without the cartoon gimmicks. It was the ultimate balance of brains and brawn. And while it may have lived in the Roadrunner's shadow, it was in many ways the more complete and satisfying machine. For the enthusiasts who remember driving one, the GTX was not just a car. It was proof that you could be a gentleman and a street fighter at the same time. The 1969 Mercury Cougar Eliminator 428 Cobra Jet is one of those cars that slipped through the cracks of mainstream muscle car history. Overshadowed by its Mustang cousin, yet every bit as potent, if not more interesting. While Ford's pony car stole the headlines and showroom traffic, the Cougar quietly evolved into something far more menacing in the form of the Eliminator package. It wasn't just a styling exercise or a trim level meant to lure in younger buyers. It was Mercury's unapologetic entry into the high-stakes muscle wars of the late 1960s. The Eliminator gave the Cougar teeth, attitude, and performance to match its good looks, and with the big block 428 Cobra Jet engine lurking under the hood, it became a true street predator. When the Eliminator debuted in 1969, it brought with it an aggressive appearance package that immediately set it apart from the standard Cougar. A unique blackout grille with a body-colored scoop, bold stripes running down the sides, and a rear deck spoiler transformed the Cougar from sleek and stylish into something that looked ready for a fight. Mercury painted the Eliminator in wild, retina-burning colors like bright orange, competition blue, and yellow, shades that announced loud and clear that this was not your father's Mercury. Inside, the car still offered Mercury's upscale touches, but the Eliminator wasn't about quiet luxury. It was about harnessing the muscle car movement and giving Lincoln Mercury dealers something that could go head-to-head with the GTO, Chevelle SS, and Charger RT. At the heart of the beast was Ford's 428 cubic inch Cobra Jet V8, one of the most feared engines of its time. On paper, Mercury rated it at 335 horsepower, but anyone who knew Ford's tendency to underrate engines for insurance and corporate politics understood the truth. This motor was closer to 400 horses, with torque so immense that it felt like the car could twist the pavement beneath it. The Cobra Jet wasn't delicate. It thrived on raw, brutal thrust, with gobs of mid-range power that made stoplight duels a one-sided affair. Buyers could even opt for the Ram Air induction setup, which added a functional hood scoop feeding cold air directly into the beast, making it even more formidable. Performance magazines of the day put the Cougar Eliminator 428 CJ in the low to mid-14-second bracket for the quarter mile, with trap speeds brushing 100 miles per hour. That meant it could hang with or even outrun big names like the Pontiac GTO Judge, Dodge Super B, and Chevy Chevelle SS 396. With a bit of tuning, slicks, and open headers, these cars could easily dip into the 13s, putting them in serious muscle car company. Yet while the Mustang Mach-1 and Boss 429 hogged the spotlight, the Cougar did its work quietly in the shadows, just as fast but far more exclusive. And exclusivity was key. Only around 2,250 Eliminators were built in 1969, and of those, a much smaller number carried the 428 Cobra Jet. That makes the 428 CJ Eliminator one of the rarest and most desirable Cougars ever built. For many enthusiasts, that's part of the charm. It wasn't a car you saw on every corner, and even today, spotting one at a show feels like stumbling across a hidden treasure. Owners who were lucky enough to drive them when new often recalled the surprise factor. One former owner remembered, "Everyone lined up against Mustangs and Camaros, but when they saw my Cougar with stripes, they thought it was just a dressed-up Mercury. They had no idea what was under the hood until it was too late." Another enthusiast put it more bluntly, "It was a Mustang in a tuxedo with brass knuckles in the pocket." The Cougar offered more refinement inside, with better sound insulation and a slightly more upscale interior than the Mustang, but the experience behind the wheel was anything but genteel. It was violent, immediate, and exhilarating. The Eliminator 428 CJ also carried a kind of rebellious identity. Buying one meant you weren't following the herd into Mustang territory. You wanted something different, something rarer, something that felt just a little more exclusive. Mercury wasn't exactly known for street terrors, but the Eliminator changed that perception overnight. Unfortunately, it was a case of too little, too late. Muscle car insurance premiums were already climbing, and the golden age was about to fade. By the early 1970s, emissions regulations and fuel crises would neuter the Eliminator and then erase it altogether. Today, the 1969 Cougar Eliminator 428 Cobra Jet sits firmly in the category of forgotten muscle legends. It had the looks, the speed, and the rarity, but not the marketing push that could have made it a household name. For collectors, it represents the perfect blend of performance and obscurity, a true wolf in sheep's clothing wrapped in bright stripes and Mercury refinement. For those who remember it, the car was proof that sometimes the greatest machines of the muscle era weren't the ones that shouted the loudest, but the ones that struck hardest when nobody was looking. Do you want me to expand this even further by weaving in direct road test quotes from period magazines like Car and Driver? Comparisons to the Mach 1 and GTO Judge, and dramatic drag strip anecdotes from owners who claimed the Eliminator could shock even the most confident Hemi drivers? The 1978 Pontiac Firebird Formula 400 W72 is one of those cars that history has unfairly left in the shadows, forever living under the overwhelming presence of its more flamboyant sibling, the Trans Am. When people think of late 70s Firebirds, they imagine black and gold bandit Trans Ams with screaming chicken decals plastered across the hood, Burt Reynolds behind the wheel, and a trail of Smokey and the Bandit pop culture hype in their wake. What they forget is that in the same showrooms sat the Formula 400 W72, a leaner, quieter, and in many ways, purer machine. It didn't need hood birds, flared wheel arches, or movie star hype. It had the heart of a true muscle car, built for drivers who wanted performance without theatrics. By 1978, the American muscle car was on life support. Regulations, insurance hikes, emissions controls, and the oil crisis had gutted the industry, leaving behind once proud names now saddled with weak engines and suffocating smog equipment. Pontiac, however, refused to give up the fight. The division had always been the rebel of GM, the one brand that still believed in building performance cars even when the corporate office in Detroit told them otherwise. The W72 400 was the last gasp of that rebellious spirit, a carefully massaged version of Pontiac's 400 cubic inch V8 that kept the flame alive when nearly everything else had gone cold. On paper, the W72 didn't look like much. Pontiac officially rated it at 220 horsepower, which by late 70s standards was impressive, but nothing close to the big block terrors of a decade earlier. But those numbers lied. Engineers quietly underrated the motor to keep insurance companies and federal regulators off their backs. In truth, the W72 was closer to 250-260 horsepower, with torque figures that made it feel much stronger than the brochure suggested. Its secret lay in carefully chosen internals: a hotter camshaft, better cylinder heads, freer breathing exhaust manifolds, and a Rochester quadrijet carburetor tuned specifically for maximum punch. It wasn't a relic, it was a re-engineered survivor. Where the Trans Am loaded on style and weight with spoilers, flares, and decals, the Formula remained stripped down and focused. Its dual-scooped hood was aggressive but understated, its body clean and uncluttered. That meant it weighed less than a Trans Am, and with the same W72 under the hood, it could be just as quick, sometimes quicker in real-world conditions. Car and driver testers of the era clocked 0 to 60 times in the 6.7 to 7-second range, with quarter-mile runs around 15 seconds flat. That may sound tame by modern standards, but in 1978, when most V8 coupes struggled to crack 17 seconds in the quarter, the Formula 400 W72 was a revelation. And it wasn't just about straight-line speed. Pontiac had spent the 1970s fine-tuning the Firebird suspension, and by the late decade, it had become one of the best-handling American coupes you could buy. Reviewers praised its cornering ability and stability at high speeds, calling it one of the few true driver's cars left on the market. The Formula, without the excess weight and aerodynamic drag of Trans Am add-ons, felt sharper, more eager, more precise. Enthusiasts who knew the difference often considered it the smarter choice, the car you bought if you cared about performance rather than attention. But therein lay the problem. The Formula 400 W72 didn't scream for the spotlight. It wasn't a pop culture icon. It was subtle, almost stealthy. And in a decade where image sold more than substance, it was inevitably outshined. Pontiac dealers sold thousands more Trans Ams than Formulas, leaving the W72 Formula as a rare sight even when new. Many buyers simply didn't realize that under its understated bodywork was the same fire-breathing heart that kept the Trans Am alive as the last real muscle car of the 1970s. Owners who did take the plunge often recall the satisfaction of having a car that outsiders underestimated. One owner put it simply, "People would pull up next to me, laugh that it wasn't a Trans Am, then get real quiet when I left them in the dust." Another remembered how the Formula struck a balance. It wasn't a show-off car, it was a driver's car. You could take it on a road trip, push it on a winding road, and then line up at a drag strip. And it would do all of it with no drama. Today, the Formula 400 W72 has earned a reputation as the connoisseur's Firebird. Collectors know the Trans Am will always be the crowd pleaser, but the Formula is the hidden gem. The car that gave you all the performance, less weight, cleaner lines, and far more exclusivity. With production numbers low and survival rates even lower, finding one in good condition is like uncovering a time capsule from the last days of the true muscle car era. The 1978 Pontiac Firebird Formula 400 W72 is proof that sometimes the greatest cars aren't the ones plastered on posters or immortalized in movies, but the ones that quietly carried the torch when no one else would. It was lean, fast, and honest, a final shot of adrenaline in a decade that tried to bury muscle cars for good. For those who drove one, it wasn't just transportation. It was Pontiac's last stand, a reminder that even in the darkest days, there was still fire in the bird. Would you like me to make this even longer by digging into period road test comparisons with the Camaro Z28 and Mustang II Cobra, as well as Pontiac insiders, stories about how they kept the W72 alive despite GM corporate trying to kill big engines?
The 1963 Studebaker Avanti R2 supercharged V8 is one of those rare cars that exists almost entirely in the realm of legend, a machine that promised greatness but was swallowed by circumstance before it could truly leave its mark. To understand the Avanti R2, you have to step back into the early 1960s when Studebaker was a struggling independent automaker desperately trying to remain relevant in a world dominated by Detroit giants. The company had been hemorrhaging sales and its future looked bleak. Enter the Avanti, a car that was supposed to be Studebaker's bold, futuristic answer to the Corvette, a statement that said, "We're not dead yet, and we can still shock the world." The R2 version, with its supercharged 289 V8, was the ultimate expression of that ambition, a hand-built, high-tech,
utterly insane sports coupe that should have changed the narrative for the brand entirely. Stylistically, the Avanti was unlike anything else on the American market. It was designed by Raymond Loewy's studio and took cues from European Grand Tours, yet it retained a certain aggressive American presence. The long, sloping hood, low-profile lows, and distinctive, almost grille-less front end made the Avanti immediately recognizable. It looked like a car that was moving even when standing still, futuristic yet aggressive, and every line seemed to whisper speed. While the standard Avanti already drew attention, the R2 took things a step further. Subtle badging, a slightly lowered stance, and carefully tuned aerodynamics hinted at the raw power lurking beneath. Under that long hood sat a 289 cubic inch V8 with a Paxton supercharger bolted on top. Officially rated at 290 horsepower, it was more than capable of making the Avanti R2 a serious performance machine. The car weighed just under 3,000 pounds, and with that supercharged V8, it could accelerate with authority that stunned journalists and competitors alike. In period road tests, it sprinted past most domestic and European sports cars, handling like a lighter European GT while delivering muscle car brutal torque. What truly set the Avanti R2 apart, however, was its top speed. On the Bonneville Salt Flats, drivers pushed the car to over 170 miles per hour, setting national speed records for American production cars in its displacement class. In 1963, this was an extraordinary achievement, astonishing even when compared to Corvette Z06s and the most exotic European sports cars of the era. Driving the Avanti R2 was an experience that blended sophistication with menace. Owners recalled that the Paxton supercharger delivered a wave of torque that hit instantly, forcing you to pay attention and respect the throttle. It didn't just accelerate, it lunged, and it kept lunging until you were holding on for dear life. Yet despite the raw power, the car's handling, thanks to independent front suspension and a surprisingly balanced chassis, allowed it to corner like a lightweight European sports car. It was both civilized and frightening, a dual personality that few other American cars could claim at the time. The tragedy of the Avanti R2 is that it never got the audience it deserved. Studebaker was in terminal decline, with financial instability and production delays hampering the rollout of the Avanti. By the time the R2 prototypes were completed, the company was already in crisis. Production was limited to just a handful of these supercharged machines, meaning that very few people ever got to experience its performance firsthand. The mainstream press gave it glowing reviews, but the public largely never saw it, and by 1964, Studebaker was struggling to survive at all, let alone push niche high-performance cars. The Avanti R2 became a legend almost immediately, talked about, admired, and envied, yet frustratingly inaccessible. Its legacy, however, is staggering. In a world dominated by Detroit's big engines and conservative designs, the Avanti R2 proved that an independent automaker could think differently, innovate, and produce a car that was capable of real-world supercar-level performance. The supercharged 289 V8, combined with the lightweight fiberglass body and meticulous suspension tuning, created a machine that not only rivaled the Corvette, but in some ways outclassed it in top-end performance and handling finesse. Collectors today revere the R2, not just for its rarity, but because it represents the pinnacle of Studebaker's ambition, what could have been moment frozen in time. Driving one today is like stepping into an alternate history where Studebaker survived, thrived, and competed with Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler on a completely different plane. Every press of the accelerator reminds you that this car was built to go fast, to break records, and to turn heads. Yet it also carries the weight of lost potential. Unlike more famous muscle cars, the Avanti R2 was never mass-produced, never marketed to the masses, and never fully celebrated in its own time. It exists almost entirely in the memory of a few enthusiasts, period road tests, and the salt flats where it roared past 170 miles per hour while the rest of the world watched in disbelief. In short, the 1963 Studebaker Avanti R2 supercharged V8 is the ultimate Hail Mary of the American muscle era, a car that dared to be more than just a production model, that combined raw speed, technical innovation, and futuristic styling in a package almost no one had the chance to experience. It was brilliant, insane, and doomed, yet it remains one of the most extraordinary forgotten cars in automotive history.
The 1971 Tomaso Pantera is one of those rare, borderline mythical cars that perfectly encapsulates the wild, borderline reckless spirit of early 70s automotive culture. At first glance, it looks like an Italian exotic pulled straight from a Modena showroom, sharp, low-slung, wedge-shaped, with almost aggressively sensual lines that seem sculpted to slice through the air at 180 miles per hour. It's Ferrari-esque without ever quite being a Ferrari, a car that could make the casual observer's heart leap and car magazines drool. But what makes the Pantera truly remarkable is what's under that sleek fiberglass and steel skin, an all-American Ford 351 Cleveland V8. It's a juxtaposition that could have been ridiculous if it weren't executed with such brash confidence. An Italian exotic that can be serviced at your local Lincoln Mercury dealer, a machine that looks elegant but accelerates like a lunatic. The Pantera's story begins with Alejandro de Tomaso, the Argentine entrepreneur who founded the company in the 1960s. His vision was simple but ambitious. Take the styling cues and prestige of Italian supercars, combine them with the reliability, ease of maintenance, and raw power of American V8s, and create a car that was exotic yet usable. The Pantera debuted in 1971, and immediately it felt like a shock to the system. This wasn't a European GT that required obsessive maintenance, delicate suspension tuning, or expensive parts imported from halfway around the world. The Ford 351 Cleveland V8, rated at roughly 330 horsepower in its early guise, delivered torque generously and aggressively, propelling the car from 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds, a figure that was blistering for the time. Its quarter-mile times hovered around the low 13-second range, making it competitive with domestic muscle cars while wearing a body that looked like it had come off the cover of Road and Track. Driving the Pantera was a sensory onslaught. The steering was precise but direct, transmitting every nuance of the road to the driver. The engine roared with brutal authority, a sound that married American V8 ferocity to the exotic echo of a mid-engine chassis. The suspension was stiff, the brakes quick to fade under aggressive use, and the cockpit snug, with little padding between driver and machine. It wasn't a comfort car. It was a car for people who wanted to feel every vibration, every shift, every heartbeat of the engine. Owners who spent time behind the wheel often described it as addictive, but unforgiving. One moment you're cruising along, feeling like a movie star, the next you're slamming the wheel to keep the tail from stepping out in a corner. It's intoxicating, terrifying, and impossible to forget. But the Pantera was not without its problems. Its reliability, while better than many Italian contemporaries, was inconsistent. Cooling issues, transmission quirks, and the occasional electrical gremlin plagued early owners, especially those who pushed the car hard. Lincoln Mercury dealers who had agreed to sell the Pantera in the United States often found themselves unprepared to handle these exotic anomalies. Service manuals were thin, spare parts were scarce, and warranty claims were a headache. Despite these issues, enthusiasts embraced the Pantera for what it was, a raw, unfiltered driving experience that felt far closer to a race car than most production vehicles. It wasn't about ease of use, it was about adrenaline, control, and the joy of commanding a machine that few people on the road could even imagine existing. The Pantera also occupied a unique cultural niche. It bridged the gap between European sophistication and American muscle, attracting buyers who wanted the flair of Modena with the practicality of Detroit engineering. Celebrities, executives, and automotive enthusiasts were drawn to it, not just for the performance, but for the statement it made. Unlike a Corvette which screamed American muscle, or a Ferrari which whispered European wealth, the Pantera shouted, "I'm both, and I don't care what you think."
Despite its flaws, the Pantera left a mark on automotive history that few other cars of the era could match. It was exotic, fast, visually striking, and mechanically accessible in a way that made it unique among supercars. It wasn't a perfect car, but perfection was never the point. The Pantera was raw, audacious, and intoxicatingly fun, a car that rewarded bravery and punished complacency. It is remembered today as one of the most thrilling, borderline insane vehicles of the early 70s, a symbol of what happens when designers and engineers throw caution to the wind and build a car purely for the thrill of it. In essence, the 1971 Tomaso Pantera is a car of contradictions. Italian beauty with American brawn, exotic thrills with domestic practicality, audacious styling with visceral performance. It was, and still is, a machine that demands respect, daring, and absolute focus. A rare and unforgettable jewel from an era when cars were allowed to be wild, dangerous, and unforgettable.
The 1968 Chevrolet Corvette L88 occupies a rarefied place in American automotive history. A machine that was less a street car and more a thoroughbred racer masquerading as a production model. While the standard Corvette was already a performance icon, the L88 took everything up several notches, creating a vehicle that was frighteningly fast, brutally uncompromising, and almost absurdly specialized for its time. Officially, Chevrolet rated the L88's 427 cubic inch V8 at 430 horsepower, but anyone who understood the engineering knew the numbers were a deliberate understatement. In reality, the L88 produced closer to 550 horsepower at the flywheel, a staggering figure in 1968, especially for a car that weighed under 3,300 pounds. Torque was massive, acceleration was explosive, and the car was, in every sense, a Corvette built for the racetrack rather than the boulevard. Chevrolet's engineers built the L88 with a singular focus: raw performance. Almost every concession to comfort or street practicality was stripped away. The interior was Spartan. Sound deadening, carpets, and luxury options were minimized or eliminated entirely to save weight. The engine bay was stuffed with high-lift cams, aluminum cylinder heads, and a massive Holy carburetor, designed to let the 427 breathe like a living beast. Exhaust flowed freely through side pipes, giving the L88 an oral signature that was both spine-tingling and terrifying to the uninitiated. In many ways, driving the L88 was an act of courage. Every throttle input demanded respect, every corner tested your skill. Chevrolet was well aware of just how extreme the L88 was. Dealers were explicitly instructed not to sell the car to casual buyers or anyone who wasn't experienced with high-performance vehicles. It was essentially a race car that had to be street legal, and the company did not want it falling into the hands of someone unprepared for its ferocity. The throttle was instant, the steering direct, the chassis was unforgiving, and the brakes, though beefy for the era, were no substitute for careful judgment. Owners would often describe it as a car that could terrify you at low speeds and delight you at high ones, a paradox of raw power and precision. Performance numbers of the day tell the story. Quarter-mile times dipped into the low 12-second range, with trap speeds approaching 115 miles per hour, astonishing for a 1968 street-legal Corvette. On road courses and test tracks, the L88 proved equally formidable, able to hold its own against purpose-built race cars and European sports cars, earning it a reputation as one of the fastest production vehicles of its era. Yet, because the car was so extreme, it was also unforgiving. Over-rev it, and catastrophic engine failure could follow. Misjudge a corner, and the rear tires would step out violently. Every drive demanded focus, skill, and respect, qualities that made the L88 a machine for serious enthusiasts only. Collectors today revere the 1968 L88 not just for its rarity, fewer than 80 examples were built, but also for its pure, unfiltered nature. Unlike Corvettes with automatic transmissions, plush interiors, and touring packages, the L88 stripped everything down to performance essentials. Owning one was like holding a piece of racing history, a car that could dominate on the track and terrorize the street, all in one lightweight fiberglass body.
Auction results reflect its legendary status, with original L88s routinely commanding millions of dollars. Yet for the general public, the L88 remains somewhat obscure, overshadowed by the more common Stingray models and the broader Corvette mystique. The L88's story is also a cautionary tale about corporate caution in the muscle car era. Chevrolet knew they had a weapon, a car that could embarrass nearly any competitor, but they also knew it was dangerous. Selling it to casual drivers could result in accidents, lawsuits, and disaster. By limiting production and carefully vetting buyers, Chevrolet ensured that the L88 would remain the exclusive, feared, and highly coveted legend that it is today. Driving a 1968 L88 today is a reminder of just how unrestrained American performance cars could be at the peak of the muscle car era. The throttle is alive, the exhaust screams, and the car will punish any hesitation or mistake, but reward courage, precision, and respect in equal measure. It is raw, wild, and uncompromising, a reminder that the Corvette was more than just a stylish American sports car. At its L88 apex, it was a weapon, a masterpiece of mechanical audacity, and a machine that dared to challenge both man and machine alike. If you want, I can expand this into a much longer, highly detailed version, including period test data, racing exploits, owner anecdotes of near disasters, comparisons to contemporaries like the ZL1 Camaro and 1047 Cobra, and insight into how Chevrolet engineered the L88 to be simultaneously legal, drivable, and nearly lethal.
The 1970 AMC AMX 390 is one of those rare American cars that seems to exist more in enthusiasts' whispered legends than in mainstream memory. A short-wheelbase, two-seat sports car that was AMC's audacious bid to punch above its weight. At a time when the muscle car wars were dominated by the likes of Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Ford, AMC, a company often dismissed as a small, conservative, and unassuming player, decided to throw caution to the wind and go head-to-head with the big boys. The AMX wasn't just a compact muscle coupe, it was a radical statement, a lightweight, brutally fast, and sharply styled machine built for the kind of performance that made full-sized Mopars and Fords look overconfident. The AMX's defining feature was its layout. Unlike most muscle cars of the era, which were based on mid-sized or full-sized sedans, the AMX was a bespoke two-seater, essentially a Corvette competitor in miniature. It had a short wheelbase, tight turning radius, and low curb weight, giving it nimble handling uncommon in American muscle. When you added AMC's 390 cubic inch V8 into the mix, the car became a serious weapon. The engine, rated at 315 to 325 horsepower, delivered torquey, immediate power, and with stock AMX gearing, the car could hit the quarter mile in the low 14-second range, numbers that rivaled far more famous muscle machines like the Camaro SS 396, Dodge Challenger RT, and even some Corvette trims. What made it even more impressive was how the AMX managed to combine this power with a chassis that was so responsive and agile, giving it a driving feel that many of its larger contemporaries could not match. Styling was equally daring. The AMX wore short, almost stubby proportions that accentuated its aggressive stance, long hood, and sharply raked rear deck. It didn't need spoilers, fancy decals, or racing stripes. Its wedge-like shape, clean lines, and muscular fenders spoke for themselves. Inside, the car was Spartan but functional, bucket seats, a center console-mounted shifter, and a dash that emphasized performance over luxury. Owners often remarked that the cockpit felt tight, intimate, and intensely focused, as if the car itself were daring you to drive it hard. Performance reviews from the period praised the AMX's combination of power and handling. Car and driver testers were surprised at how quick it felt off the line, and the car's short wheelbase made cornering a visceral, thrilling experience, especially compared to heavier muscle coupes that could only sweep through turns with brute force. The AMX could literally run rings around many larger, supposedly faster competitors, and yet it carried itself with a sense of poise that belied its raw power. One period reviewer described it as a small, angry cat in a cheetah's body, a perfect metaphor for the car's blend of compact agility and untamed performance. AMC's intent was clear.
The AMX 390 was their answer to the Corvette. Their statement that a smaller, less resourced company could produce a legitimate sports muscle machine capable of running with the big boys. It had the power, the style, and the exclusivity that gave it street credibility. Yet despite its capabilities, the AMX never achieved the same cultural impact as Detroit's larger muscle cars. Marketing budgets were small, dealership networks limited, and AMC simply couldn't compete with the hype machines behind Ford, Chevrolet, or Plymouth. This left the AMX a hidden gem, a car that enthusiasts recognized for its performance, but which remained largely invisible to the general public. Ownership stories reinforced the car's legacy. One AMX owner recalled lining up against a Chevrolet SS 396 at a local drag strip. He laughed when he saw my little AMX. By the time I crossed the line, he was speechless. That short wheelbase just catapulted me off the line, and he couldn't react fast enough. Another enthusiast described the car as an underestimated terror, a machine that combined muscle car shock with sports car precision, leaving competitors scrambling to adjust. Today, the 1970 AMC AMX 390 is celebrated as a rare survivor of an era dominated by corporate giants. It represents the audacity of a small company taking risks that few thought it could afford, building a two-seat machine that was fast, nimble, and uniquely American. While it may never have achieved the cultural fame of the Mustang, Camaro, or Corvette, the AMX 390 remains a favorite among collectors and enthusiasts who value its rarity, performance, and the story of a scrappy independent taking on Detroit's muscle car titans.
The 1969 Ford Torino Talladega 428 Cobra Jet is one of the rarest and most fascinating muscle cars of the late 1960s, a vehicle that embodies everything wild, precise, and competitive about the golden era of American V8 performance. Unlike the Mustang, which became a mainstream star, or the Chevelle, which dominated both the street and strip, the Talladega was a specialist, a car built to win on NASCAR tracks first and to terrify enthusiasts second. Its existence on public streets was almost accidental, a homologation exercise that resulted in a handful of cars with a reputation so brutal and rare that even today, few enthusiasts have had the chance to experience one firsthand. Ford created the Talladega specifically to dominate NASCAR in 1969. The engineers realized that the standard Torino coupe's aerodynamics simply weren't enough to challenge Chrysler's Dodge Chargers and Plymouth Roadrunners, or GM's Chevy Chevelle SS machines. So they reshaped the Torino body, giving it a longer, sleeker nose, a more raked windshield, and a slightly modified rear to reduce drag and improve high-speed stability. Unlike the Mustang, which became a mainstream star, or the Chevelle, which dominated both the street and strip, the Talladega was a specialist, a car built to win on NASCAR tracks first and to terrify enthusiasts second. Its existence on public streets was almost accidental, a homologation exercise that resulted in a handful of cars with a reputation so brutal and rare that even today, few enthusiasts have had the chance to experience one firsthand. Ford created the Talladega specifically to dominate NASCAR in 1969. The engineers realized that the standard Torino coupe's aerodynamics simply weren't enough to challenge Chrysler's streamlined Dodge Chargers and Plymouth Roadrunners, or GM's Chevy Chevelle SS machines. So they reshaped the Torino body, giving it a longer, sleeker nose, a more raked windshield, and a slightly modified rear to reduce drag and improve high-speed stability. Unlike the production models rolling off assembly lines for everyday buyers, the Talladega was purpose-built, engineered with precision to cut through the air at speeds well above what most drivers would ever dare on public roads. It looked subtle to the untrained eye, a Torino silhouette, but every line was optimized for performance, a kind of stealth aggression masked in a seemingly ordinary body. Under the hood sat the legendary 428 Cobra Jet V8, Ford's big block powerhouse rated at 335 horsepower, but widely known to produce well over 400 in real-world terms. When paired with heavy-duty suspension, beefed-up brakes, and a close-ratio manual or automatic transmission, the Talladega became a street-legal missile.
Acceleration was ferocious, 0 to 60 miles per hour in roughly 6 seconds, quarter-mile runs in the low 14-second range, with trap speeds touching 100 miles per hour. Numbers that rivaled far more famous muscle cars, but came in a vehicle that most people assumed was a regular Torino. The car wasn't just fast in a straight line either. The suspension modifications and aerodynamic tweaks allowed it to handle high-speed corners on limited tracks better than almost any other Ford of the time, giving it a unique dual personality of brute force and road-hugging stability. Production numbers for the street-legal Talladega were astonishingly low, just over 750 examples depending on the source. That scarcity immediately elevated the car to near mythical status, particularly among collectors who understood that very few people would ever encounter one outside of a museum or private collection. It wasn't meant to be a mass-market performer. It was intended as a homologation car, the kind of machine that required you to know what you were doing behind the wheel. Ford even encouraged careful ownership. These were high-powered, high-strung V8 warriors, and a misstep on public roads could easily lead to disaster. Owners who actually drove Talladegas often recall the combination of intimidation and exultation. One described the experience as like taming a wild animal that also knows how to fly, noting the instantaneous torque from the Cobra jet and the way the car would lunge forward with terrifying authority. Another remembered lining up at a local drag strip and blowing past more popular muscle cars. They thought they could race a Mustang or a Chevelle. I let the Talladega do its thing, and they didn't know what hit them. It was smooth, but brutal, all at once. These first-hand experiences reinforce what contemporary road testers also found. The Talladega was more than just fast. It was engineered for domination, both psychologically and mechanically. The Talladega also illustrates the extremes of the late 1960s muscle car arms race. While mainstream cars were racing to appease suburban buyers with comfort and style, Ford was quietly pushing the limits of aerodynamics, engine performance, and handling to compete in one of the most punishing forms of motorsport, NASCAR. The fact that the car also existed as a street-legal vehicle only adds to its legend. It was rare, powerful, and fundamentally dangerous in ways most production cars weren't. A true V8 warrior that lived in the shadow of bigger names but could compete toe-to-toe with the best. Today, the 1969 Ford Torino Talladega 428 Cobra jet is celebrated among collectors and enthusiasts as one of Ford's most underappreciated muscle cars. Its combination of NASCAR-inspired aerodynamics, big block power, rarity, and sheer ferocity makes it a crown jewel for anyone seeking the hidden gems of the muscle car era. Unlike Mustangs or Chevelles, which achieved fame through marketing and mass production, the Talladega remains a car of legend, whispered about among aficionados, coveted by collectors, and feared by anyone fortunate enough to be beaten off the line. If you want, I can create an even longer, almost encyclopedic version, including period magazine road tests, drag strip anecdotes, comparisons to the Dodge Charger Daytona and Plymouth Superbird, and detailed notes on how the homologation program shaped its body and performance.
The 1972 Buick Riviera GS Stage 1 is one of the most fascinating contradictions in the muscle car era. A car that looks like a stately, opulent luxury coupe, but hides a heart of pure, unrestrained fury beneath its elegant hood. Buick, long known for plush interiors, smooth rides, and gentlemanly refinement, decided to throw caution to the wind and create a performance machine that could stand toe-to-toe with the era's muscle legends, but do so with a veneer of sophistication that would make it almost invisible to casual observers. The GS Stage 1 was essentially Buick's answer to the Corvette, Chevrolet SS, and Pontiac GTO, a big, comfortable luxury coupe with a big block V8 that could shock the unwary with how brutally fast it truly was. Under the hood sat Buick's 455 cubic inch V8, a mighty engine capable of producing vast amounts of torque. The Stage 1 package was officially rated at 280 horsepower, but anyone who knew Buick understood that the company routinely underrated its muscle cars for insurance and regulatory reasons. In reality, the 455 and Stage 1 trim was closer to 350-360 horsepower at the crank, and more importantly, it delivered monstrous torque,
over 500 pound-feet in some configurations, making the car feel unstoppable from the moment your foot touched the accelerator. The power came on smoothly at low RPM, then built into a relentless surge, a tidal wave of force that could easily overwhelm tires, suspensions, and even an experienced driver's nerves if unleashed without respect. The Riviera itself was already a striking car, with its long hood, flowing lines, and almost European elegance. The GS Stage 1 added subtle performance cues: a cowl induction hood, slightly flared fenders, rally-style wheels, and tasteful badging. Nothing screamed muscle car at first glance. It was a car that could roll into a dinner party without raising eyebrows, then obliterate anything in its path once the throttle was opened. Buick intentionally kept the styling understated so that the car's performance would remain a surprise to those unfamiliar with its capabilities. In essence, it was a wolf in silk pajamas, a combination of refinement and raw brutality. Performance figures of the day were impressive. Road tests clocked the Riviera GS Stage 1 with 0 to 60 times in the mid to low 6-second range and quarter-mile passes in the low 14-second territory, with trap speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. For a car that weighed over 4,000 pounds and came equipped with luxurious interiors, soundproofing, and comfort-focused suspension, these numbers were staggering. The torque-heavy 455 allowed effortless acceleration in top gear, making highway passing and overtaking a terrifyingly easy task. Drivers often describe the experience as stealthy violence. The car could feel docile while cruising, then suddenly explode forward with unstoppable force the instant you touch the gas. Owners from the era often recall the dual nature of the GS Stage 1. One enthusiast remembered lining up against a younger muscle car driver in a Camaro SS and quietly watching him underestimate the Riviera. He thought it was just a Buick, nice and soft. When I hit the throttle, he didn't even get the chance to laugh. The torque just grabbed him and left him in the dust. Another noted that while the car could handle drag strip duties with surprising authority, it remained comfortable enough for long-distance cruising, with plush seats, smooth ride quality, and quiet cabin, a combination virtually non-existent among other muscle cars of the period. The Riviera GS Stage 1 also represents Buick's unique approach to performance during the muscle car era. Unlike Chevrolet, Pontiac, or Dodge, which sold stripped-down, loud, and visually aggressive cars, Buick focused on understated performance, refinement, and intimidation combined. The Stage 1 was engineered to deliver muscle without flash, to shock the uninitiated, and to provide a driving experience that was luxurious, fast, and uniquely American. It was a car for those who wanted to feel like they owned something special without screaming about it. Despite its performance, the GS Stage 1 was largely forgotten by the broader public. It never received the cultural fanfare of a Chevrolet SS, Camaro Z28, or Pontiac GTO, largely because Buick's marketing didn't target young buyers or street racers. Production numbers were limited compared to its peers, and many people didn't realize that beneath the Riviera's elegant skin lurked a car capable of terrifying acceleration and raw power. As a result, it became a hidden gem, a sleeper that rewarded those who understood its potential. Today, the 1972 Buick Riviera GS Stage 1 is celebrated by collectors and muscle car enthusiasts for its unique combination of luxury, performance, and rarity. It's a car that can still shock the unprepared driver, a reminder that Buick was capable of producing not just comfort-oriented cars, but machines with genuine speed and personality. In a world dominated by loud, overtly aggressive muscle cars, the Stage 1 remains a subtle masterpiece, elegant, commanding, and shockingly fast. I can make an even longer version, weaving in period road tests, owner anecdotes, comparisons to Chevelle SS 454, Pontiac GTO Judge, and commentary on how Buick managed to blend luxury with pure muscle in a way no other manufacturer attempted. Do you want me to do that? The 1965 Sunbeam Tiger is one of those delightful oddities in automotive history. A tiny, charming British roadster with a personality so explosive it could make far larger, more aggressive American muscle cars look sluggish by comparison. At first glance, the Tiger seems almost harmless. A compact, low-slung two-seater with delicate, curvaceous British styling, petite wheel arches, and a demeanor that says Sunday drive along the coast. But peek under the hood and the illusion vanishes. Sunbeam, a relatively minor player in the British sports car scene, teamed with Carroll Shelby to do something daring and unprecedented: cram a Ford V8 engine into a car that was originally designed for a small four-cylinder motor. The result was a diminutive, nimble roadster capable of performance that few of its contemporaries could match, a true forgotten V8 rocket of the mid-1960s. The story begins with the Alpine-based Sunbeam Alpine, which already had a reputation as a competent, lightweight British roadster, but it lacked the raw power that American enthusiasts demanded in the muscle era. Enter Carroll Shelby, fresh off the success of his Cobra project, who recognized the potential in mating a compact, agile chassis with a small block V8. The Tiger initially used Ford's 260 cubic inch V8, later upgraded to the 289, producing roughly 164 to 271 horsepower depending on specification. For a car that weighed barely 2,200 pounds, that kind of power was nothing short of astonishing. Acceleration was immediate, the torque brutal, and the top speed easily crept past 120 miles per hour, a figure that rivaled mid-1960s Mustangs, Corvettes, and even some early Camaros, despite being a fraction of their size. Driving the Tiger was an exercise in both exhilaration and terror. The car's tiny footprint, lightweight, and short wheelbase made it incredibly agile, but also twitchy at high speeds. Owners often recalled that it felt like riding a live wire. Every corner, every bump in the road, every adjustment to the throttle was transmitted directly to the driver. Yet this wasn't just a wild ride, it was controlled, refined chaos. Shelby and Sunbeam engineers tuned the suspension and chassis to balance the raw V8 torque with the car's nimble frame, creating a sports car that could carve through corners with a level of responsiveness few American muscle cars could hope to match. One period tester said, "The Tiger is like a kitten that turns into a panther the moment you step on the gas. It's playful until it decides to eat you alive." The V8-powered Sunbeam Tiger is a prototype car from 1965. It was a joint venture between the British carmaker Sunbeam and American car designer Carroll Shelby. The goal was to create a high-performance sports car that would appeal to the burgeoning American market, but with a more European handling. The Sunbeam Tiger could get all the way up to 120 miles per hour, which was very impressive for the mid-1960s.